Gone are the days, are the centuries even, when government officials retired to become poets in gardens of their own design, as here in Suzhou happened for so long. A gnarled shaft of limestone here, there a willow's green locks swaying above the fish pond, a zigzag bridge to a pagoda where, far from the capital, one could finally attend to matters of real importance, the moon's reflection troubled by a carp. That's a poem called Political Poem by an American writer and poet called Jeffrey Harrison. But I guess maybe he was living in China for a while because he referenced here in Suzhou. But I thought it would be a good intro to today's episode where we're going to spend about half the time discussing politicians, the current state of career politicians, and how in an ideal degrowth future that we like to call the Solacene.
Yes, that's the name for it.
Politicians can come from a more varied range of backgrounds. And I thought this was a good poem to start with because we have this really romantic idea, or at least I do, of the poet general. You know what I mean?
Yeah, certainly. The leader who contemplates a lot, takes walks in the garden, as that poem says.
But also can direct a military, can direct economics, all this kind of thing. And that's I think that's a very noble goal to aspire to. And I think it's had its influence historically and even today still captures the imagination. I'm thinking about Dune. That kind of archetype was explored a lot in that recent movie. But building a polis, building a government around that kind of ideal, that model of an individual is maybe not the most secure and sustainable and smart way of doing things, which is effectively why you have multiple people who can all bring a part of the poet general, the samurai who writes haikus, the contemplator, as you said, or the philosopher king. You know, we kind of, we split that up. And that's kind of what a cabinet is. That's what the different branches of government do. Not everyone has to be everything, but I feel like it's best when everyone is something.
Yes, when we come together to create this ideal, because no one person will be perfect. That's why we usually work together as teams, because you could have one person who on the surface is perfect. That's probably a good thing for aspiring children who are looking up to their politicians and leaders. However, you need a team to actually execute the perfection. Otherwise, there's going to be failure. There's going to be a greed of power.
Yeah, a tyrant.
Yes.
Tyrant energy.
So how did you approach researching and thinking about the idea of a politician who is more than just a career politician?
Okay, so I wanted to look at historical examples because today it seems so rare.
Yeah,
I feel like
agree.
if you ask people off the street, what are some examples of politicians, world leaders who maybe weren't always in politics? It's going to be the same 5 or 6 names.
Yeah.
And that's a failing on the education system because there's probably only 7 or 8 names people can mention from politics anyway, but everyone's just going to say Trump, maybe Reagan, maybe Arnold Schwarzenegger, and it's obviously going to be US-centric.
Yes.
Maybe in Canada in the 2018 election, we had like a TV personality / businessman called Kevin O'Leary. He ran for prime minister. Didn't get very far, I don't think. But he was kind of trying to capture that Trump energy. Actually, I think that happened in a lot of countries, like celebrities. Oh, I can do this. And there's an easy base, maybe, depending on the country, that I can appeal to. And it won't require much experience, just name recognition, basically. But there's only a few that people will recognize from modern times, at least that their stories have become, entrenched in the consciousness. But looking historically, it's like it's not even mentioned because that's just what it usually was.
That's what I found as well.
Like that was the default until, say, the 1800s. Until basically the founding fathers in America, from what I could tell. I mean, there were obviously systems that weren't democracies, which are kind of career politicians, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Monarchies, nobility, oligarchies, where people are born into it and just stay in it. But in terms of elected officials remaining in those spaces for decades on end, seems to me like a relatively new phenomena.
Yes.
If only because people live longer now.
Yeah, and it would often be philosophers who have proven themselves, architects, engineers, who have proven to the community their value, and then the community said, we want you to lead us in this next
Yeah,
chapter.
or represent us.
Yes.
On a bigger scale. I mean, it could be a farmer.
Mm-hmm.
It could be any. It depends on the community, obviously. I had this quote because I wanted to kind of start the conversation by actually defining, well, what's wrong with a career politician?
Mm.
We talked about it a little bit last week, but I wanted to go deeper into it this week. So I have a list of pros and cons. But first, I had this quote that I saw, which says, "Politics has become the end in itself. Those who make it are mostly qualified just to play the game, but not to govern."
Yeah.
So it's this idea that the game or politics is now divorced from what it's supposed to be, which we touched on last week, about oftentimes it's easy to miss the forest for the trees. I think that's the expression. That was a quote from the Sydney Morning Herald, which was an article that said, "Career politicians aren't qualified to run the country," which I think was a funny title because that's what people who are, let's say, advocates of career politicians often say about quote unquote outsiders. They're not qualified to run the country. This article kind of made the point that when you are in such an insular lifestyle of, let's say, federal politics for many a year, you become so divorced from everyday life that you are not qualified to understand it, represent it, change it, have any opinions on it, really. And that was one of the big cons of career politicians I could think of. There's a big potential to be so distanced from the people you're supposed to be representing that you don't see the problems. You don't understand the effects of the decisions being made. And
certainly.
This is obviously a big issue with centralized power in general, I would say, because if you have one capital, but a country which is the size of a continent, then you don't really understand what's going on in the far reaches of the land.
That's even an argument against not just the career politicians, but really, really centralized government. And I don't know if you want to talk about this now or later.
No, we can, yeah.
Okay. One of my favorite parts about the degrowth philosophy is big government, but on small scales.
Yeah, I like that.
So I think government's incredibly important. I don't like it how it is right now. I try and steer away from it because it gets me frustrated. However, I imagine in the ideal future, there would be really strong governments, but it would just be within a 30 to 50 kilometer radius. Like, it wouldn't be this 1,000-kilometer wide. Like, you should be able to, oh, there's an issue over in this community, just go there instead of having to either take a plane to get there, rely on someone relaying information to you, and maybe you know someone in that community who can give you the report instead of having to rely on these reactionary policy making. Whereas I feel like if you were in a smaller area, you could either be proactive or react immediately instead of, oh, there was a flood here? Why did that devastate so many houses? Why is there no infrastructure to support the people who now don't have homes and food and access to clean water? Like, you would know why, and usually you'd be able to prevent these disasters from happening.
And the average person would care more.
Yeah, certainly.
I mean, that sounds so bad, but because it's closer.
Yeah. And you'd know the politician. And I imagine in our big government, small area, there'd be a lot more rotation. It wouldn't just be, okay, 4 years this party, 4 years this party, back and forth, back and forth.
Okay.
I imagine it'd either be like, oh, so we have this party who their platform's all about food security, but then, like, okay, that issue's been kind of fixed. So next year we're going to work on someone who's really into farming. Kind of a slower transition.
Well, yeah, the thing with the localized areas, let's say we're talking about a city, is that there isn't generally, sometimes there is, but there isn't generally such polarization in the politics of the people. So there isn't such, I don't even think there would be such fierce elections. Of course, competition's important, and of course, different parties, different opinions are important, but it wouldn't be the kind of fierce dog-eat-dog, neighbor-on-neighbor opposition that we frequently characterized federal politics as.
Yeah, and that would allow the politicians to focus on what politicians should focus on, which is enacting change instead of just getting reelected.
And for what it's worth, I also think the people would be happier because you would essentially have more say over the government of your life, of the world immediately around you, because you would be one vote out of, say, 100,000 as opposed to, I don't know, 100 million. And also, I guess there would be more options. This type of governance, this type of decentralized power would lead to more variety within a country, I suppose. Like city by city, province by province, state by state, there would be more variation in laws, in, I don't know, tax spending, in just the general look, feel, culture of the places within the overall nation. So you'd kind of have more options as to where to live. I think that's how it would work.
Yeah, and you proposed earlier today to me the idea that there didn't need to be like an Ottawa or a Washington.
Yeah, this was just I didn't really think this through, so I don't want people to judge me by it, but we can mention it.
But I thought it was cool because before you said it, I had the same idea as you were trying to formulate the thought. I thought the same thing, so it's interesting that we both did, perhaps because we're both researching this topic this week. But it's that, okay, so in Canada, you'd have your municipalities, so like your small scale governments, and then you'd have your provincial government perhaps to kind of help coordinate. And then each year, perhaps the federal election would be, which province do we want to represent us this year on the global scale, or which province do you want to be in charge of facilitating conversations across all the provinces?
Yeah, I don't know if this is much more than just a symbolic difference, to be honest. But the symbol, I think, is important because you'd essentially have every 4 years, or however long your term was, a rotating capital. And I feel like that would make people feel more represented.
I think so.
It's kind of like how the Olympics goes somewhere different each year, or each 4 years.
Yeah, there'd have to be some type of accounting for the fact that one province has way more people than the other ones. For the vote,
certainly, yeah.
But I think it would be an interesting exercise, even just to think about.
Different rotating capitals.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea. And instead of, I suppose, replacing the idea of parties would just be the places.
Yeah.
Oh, we really like how Ontario is running things. We're going to let them be the base of decision making for the next 4 years. I don't know. I think that's fun.
Yeah, I think it is as well. It lends well to my example that I picked for an example of a non-career politician. Do you mind if I jump into it?
Yeah, say it.
Okay, so in the 60s in Brazil, it was suffering a lot from rural to urban migration. So a lot of farms were shutting down because farms were being bought up and so on. So people were migrating to the cities, and the cities did not have the infrastructure to deal with so much rural to urban migration. So there was a lot of what are called favelas, or just like shanty towns popping up around the outskirts of the cities, and not good for anyone, obviously. Too much stress on all of the infrastructure. So the president of the country said, I want to redesign the capital, or make a new capital is specifically what he said. So he put out a call to all the architects in the nation, and then one said, he literally just drew a bird and said, this is my plan. And it was just a little cross bird, and he's like, I want a city to look like a bird. The president was like, you go for it. So in 4 years, he built this city from the ground up into this network of highways, and it was just like super urban, super modern, all centered around cars. The president was like, bravo, bravo. We need to make every other city in Brazil look like this.
Great.
But then there was this one town called Curitiba, which between the 60s and the 70s, so like those 10 years, their population over doubled because of all the migration. And they were like, if we adopt this highway model, no one's going to benefit. And all of our heritage is going to be lost. There was literally a plan made from 1960 to 1965 to just completely replicate the bird model. And that included ripping down a ton of historic landmarks, cutting up the few parks that they still had, and so on. But then this one architect who literally just graduated university, he was like, no, we're not doing this. And then the people were like, yeah, we're not doing this. Even though we're all kind of suffering right now, this isn't the way to stop people living in poverty. And so as an architect, for 4 years, he worked to make a plan, and the UN was working with him, and he made this plan for this new model. And Curitiba is now considered one of the greenest cities on earth.
Wow.
Because of the way that he did it. And after a few years of just working on it as a passion project, basically, he got elected as mayor. And then he worked as mayor for a few years and got it done. And it was mainly because the people liked him, but also trusted him because he had expertise in the area of urban planning and architecture. And what I think is funny is there's so many examples of him. He said, okay, this main shopping street, we're going to make it a pedestrian street. And all the shop owners were like, no, it's going to lower our business. People love pulling up their cars out front and shopping and loading all their shopping in and then leaving.
Yeah.
And then he said, I'm doing it. And they were like, well, we're going to file a lawsuit against you because you're going to take all our business. And so he went to the head construction guy and was like, I want this done over the weekend so that the law office will be closed and they cannot file against me. And he's like, this is a 4-month project. And he said, do it in 48 hours. And he did it in 72 hours. Then all the shop owners were like, oh, you were right. And that was kind of the start of it all.
That's so problematic when it comes to the idea of a democracy, but...
He has a good quote about democracy that made me laugh. But it's because, like, you need to think outside the box.
Of course, yeah.
So I have 2 quotes from him that I think sum up his reign as mayor really well. So one of them is that democracy is not a consensus. Democracy is a conflict that is well managed. Which I think is honest because democracy isn't a consensus, it's a compromise. And I think it's a really good way of thinking about it. Like, we have to manage the conflict well in order to keep functioning as a society. And his other quote is, if you want creativity, cut 1 zero out of the budget. But if you want sustainability, cut 2. And I thought that was really good. And when he was redesigning the city, he was very efficient about it. So at the time, the trend was to build subway systems. But he said that it takes way too much money, way too many resources. So what I'm going to do is a bus system. And so he designed this little bus system, which lowered the commute from the periphery of the town to the center of the town from like hours to 20 minutes for like everyone. And another cool thing about the system is that you can exchange garbage, which they recycle 70% of, so I guess just recyclables, for either produce or tokens to get onto the train.
The bus?
The bus, yeah. And he also, because it was kind of inefficient at first, his goal was to make it the most efficient way to get around so people didn't have a choice to own a car. They had to ride the bus because it was so much quicker. Like, they didn't have to, but it was the most logical thing to do.
Nice.
So he created these little things which are now used in 300 cities across the world. They're called tubes.
Okay.
So they're on the median. It's like the center line of the roads, these little tubes. And in order to get into the tube, you tap your card or you pay your fare. So that when the bus pulls up to the side of the tube, you just get on and it goes. So you don't have to tap your card once you're on the bus or exchange anything.
Okay, so you basically, you pay your fee when you get into the bus stop rather than on the bus. That makes sense.
Makes sense. And they're in the median, so it's like they're not on both sides of the road. There's just the one.
Yep.
And it's super efficient and everyone loves it and uses it. And it said 90% of the population uses the bus system. That's pretty wild.
So he's an architect.
He's an architect,
which
yes.
Is, I think to describe that in really broad historical classification, I would say he's half an engineer and half an artist.
Yes.
Something like that, but with a fundamental knowledge and grounding of the streets, you know, the soul of the city.
Yeah.
On that note, we should have a question about transportation for next week.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
What are some cool degrowth transportation ideas? I think that's just a good place to start.
I think it's a good place to start as well.
I'm going to keep going with my cons for career politicians. The next one is that I think they can often be less well-rounded. These aren't absolutes, but they're just trends that I've kind of observed. Less well-rounded and therefore also less creative. And you kind of touched on it last week, less humble. I suppose this comes from just surrounding yourself with politicians. It reminds me of this quote I was reading, or I was listening to an interview from a famous film director. I don't remember who it was. I think it was Werner Herzog, actually. And they asked him what's some advice he would give to other filmmakers. And he said, read. And they said, about film? And he was like, no, not about film, about everything other than film. Because if you don't read, if you're not constantly learning and exposing yourself to things that aren't movies, you'll have nothing to make movies about.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like in politics, if all you're reading about is movies, you might become really good at making movies, but you don't have any subject. You don't have any direction.
Yeah, certainly.
So being well-rounded is definitely important. And I think that's a lot of the appeal of the politician who farms. I was reading some of the founding fathers of America in preparation for this episode, And there's this Roman leader called Cincinnatus, who was very famous because in times of turmoil, ancient Rome would basically appoint a dictator in times of like military turmoil, just so they could work quicker and more efficient, and no time for that democracy nonsense, basically. And it was this guy Cincinnatus at one point, and he was just a farmer, and he came in, won them the war, did a bunch of really good stuff, and then kind of swore off politics and returned to his farm. And that ideal, I think, has been somewhat forgotten, I guess, recently.
Yeah, it's like if you get into politics, you get into politics.
Exactly.
But
and that's the thing with even if you had a rotating capital, that, like you mentioned earlier, just that saying of, oh, well, he's in Washington, or oh, yeah, he went to Ottawa, that wouldn't even be a thing, because there wouldn't be one seat of it. There wouldn't be one, I hate to use the word, swamp.
yeah.
And the last con that I had is that you can often get caught up in winning versus progress. And of course, I think this is filtered down largely to citizens, unfortunately, where perhaps you don't celebrate progress unless it came from your side, etc. Which is definitely the most toxic idea, and it's in direct contradiction to this concept that I learned of, which is called civic virtue, which basically refers to all the habits which are important for the success of society. And those include some level of engagement, pride, call it patriotism, involvement, which is something that I think is often looked down on. When I was looking at examples of modern civic virtues, it talked about things like the Boy Scouts and how they had to recite something at the start of their group meetings. And I feel like that specific type of education is now almost always rather cynically referred to as indoctrination or something like that. It's not always the case. It is an important thing that people care about how things are run.
Yes.
That people love their place. I feel like that's a very unpopular trait these days.
Yeah.
I know I don't really have it. So
No, we're both almost, I'd say we're like 3% patriotic.
yeah, but I wish I was more,
But patriotic to the land, to the people, not to the flag, to Ontario. That's what I think. Because in our degrown society, I imagine you would need to care about the mountains and the sea. Even if you live on the East Coast, you need to care about the mountains. Even if you live inland, you need to care about the sea.
I think you'd be a really proud New Yorker or something like that. If we're talking about degrown New York. I think that's a good trait.
Okay, I see what you mean.
You know what I'm talking about?
Care about your town.
Yes.
Yeah.
To actually care about it. Now it's like everyone's that cool kid in high school, which is most kids in high school.
Yeah.
Certainly in my high school. But often I feel like when you look back on old movies in high schools, even the cynical people, even the cool kids, everyone was like dressing up for Spirit Day. But now it's like no one dresses up for Spirit Day.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, because we don't have any, because we're so cynical about every system of authority.
Yes.
Including our high schools or our Boy
I'm saying
Scouts
it
club.
starts early.
Yeah. So that's something that we need to take back in a new way.
Do you want to hear some of the pros of career politicians?
Yeah, I'd love to.
We were both paying attention when Biden was inaugurated earlier this year and when he won the election, so I think you would have heard most of these pros then. The primary one which is mentioned is that they are well connected and potentially better at negotiating, more effective at getting things done because they know the people in Congress or Senate for hundreds of years or however long they've been alive. And also we should touch on the fact that I think at least politicians are too old in general.
Yeah.
To the point that it's not representative of their citizenry at all.
I think having older people in power makes sense. We don't want a bunch of 16-year-olds.
No, I think of course it would probably always skew older on average, but I don't think it should be exclusively really old people.
Yeah, we need wisdom. We don't need...
Trying to think of something quippy.
Yeah, but I can't.
No, I don't know. But that's certainly that's certainly, that kind of savviness that comes from being around for a long time. That's what most people would say is the number one trait for excelling in politics. Whether that's a good thing, I don't know, but it certainly is the case right now. So bureaucratic and so much about wheeling and dealing and taking that person to golf so that you can discuss, little stuff like that.
Yeah.
What do you think to that in the degrowth world?
I think connectedness is super, super important.
It'll always be, right?
I mean, I remember when the woman who's the mayor in like my hometown, she was a teacher for like 35 years. And then she said, I want to be the mayor. And there'd never been a female mayor. And she was just like, I'm going to do it. And then she did it. And she's been in office for like 15 years. But she had all the connections from being a teacher.
Of course, she knew all the populace when they grew up, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like, that's super important, and that's why she's so successful. She knows the town hall, and she knows the police station from when they would like sponsor school plays and like all those things. Like you can have connections in other ways.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Just being an involved citizen, but that type of life, those types of relationships, there's a large scale dissociation, which we talked about on the podcast, which has generally eroded those. So, teachers is one of the few exceptions, but most professions, you're not interacting with a lot of people in your town anymore. But certainly, just from a concrete, practical sense, being a good negotiator is of course an important trait. But politics is probably not the only career in which you can hone that skill.
Yeah, certainly.
Another pro is that a career politician might be more trained to be more diplomatic and more stately. You often hear in media, oh, wow, he looks very presidential. He's wearing a suit and tie and he holds himself well. And those things seem superficial, but of course they're not. They're important because on two levels. One, the people want to feel like they're being represented by someone who takes it seriously. And two, when you are conversing with other cities, other politicians, other countries on an international scale, you want to be putting your place's best foot forward, and you don't want to make a fool of yourself. Yeah,
and politicians are seasoned in not misspeaking for the most part,
of course,
and remaining level-headed.
So those
the
things
average
are certainly
person perhaps
important.
Isn't.
But I do think that kind of training, I mentioned last week that I think there should be education in rhetoric, should be more universal. Like it shouldn't only be a tiny % of the population who can give a speech convincingly.
Yeah.
That should be, that's basically what we're doing here. I don't know if you know, but the whole reason, my ulterior motive for starting the podcast was just so I could practice to eventually run.
That reminds me of a good question perhaps we can ask about education for degrowth.
Okay.
Which I know we will have a series on in the future, but I think it would be a good, worthwhile conversation topic for next week. How do we educate for degrowth?
Yeah, that's good. And the last pro that I had for a career politician is something like pattern recognition, meaning they are more well-versed in the various political situations they will come across, from perhaps being more familiar with the history of their place or just politics in general and having decades of experience. Oh, I know how this one plays out. I know what we should do kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which is why I think having people around who are older, more experienced in politics is certainly a good thing. I don't think the career politician is necessarily always bad. There's definitely pros to it, but I don't think it should be the majority of politicians. And it certainly shouldn't be everyone, that's for sure. But I think having a few old heads like that makes a lot of sense.
A good example, perhaps, that comes to mind is like Bernie has always been a politician at heart, even in university, but he was an advocate, like first and foremost, I think. And I feel like those are the types of career politicians we need, people who have experience in protests and advocating for causes. And that's politics, but I think it's a different type of politics than wheeling and dealing on the golf course.
Yeah, I agree. I had this other quote that I wanted to mention, which is kind of a devil's advocate quote, which is, if you don't allow politics to be an option for a career, you're only going to get politicians who don't need to have a career, i.e. the rich and corrupt.
Yes.
Which is why Trump, Reagan, Arnold, Another candidate for the recent American election was Michael Bloomberg, who's another billionaire, which is why most of these quote-unquote outsiders have been very, very rich and also famous, because it's like, if you're trying to break into it and not start from the ground up, the only way to kind of match the renown and the, let's say, the budget of the established parties or the other candidates is usually through a lot of money. It's kind of a pay-to-play model, or leveraging your fame a lot. So that's definitely something to point out. But I think that might only be applicable to federal elections.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit less on the small scale. I do remember recently the Conservative Party of my riding, they elected like a local musician.
Oh, wow.
I think with the sole intention of, he's famous, we can use the Trump model, and no one voted for him.
Really?
Yeah, it was very low. So it was kind of mind-blowing, because it's normally like a decent split, but everyone was like, this is a joke.
Why, because he's incompetent?
Yeah.
There should, of course, be a level of competence. We prefaced the whole thing with this last week, is that we're not advocating for... It's not a good thing to know nothing about politics.
Yeah.
Of course, that doesn't make any sense, or to know nothing about economics, or to know nothing about your country or history. That's never a good thing. It's only good to know a lot about that.
Yes.
The conversation is whether politics is the only avenue to learn those things.
Speaking of fungus, that leads me to the organism of the week.
What?
Fungus.
Were we speaking of fungus?
No, parasites maybe.
Okay.
But the organism of the week. I got to do it this week. Very excited. And I picked Lingzi, aka the reishi mushroom.
Okay.
Which
Lingzi.
which is a very famous mushroom. It's the most famous, I might say.
Really?
Do you want to see a picture?
I would have gone for toad as the most famous mushroom.
He's a bit more charismatic, but...
Okay, Lingzi. You want me to describe it?
Yep.
So it kind of looks like what I would imagine a city on Mars would look like. Like a Jetson city.
Yes.
There's these big, long, red stalks, deep red, with these kind of orange saucers on top, or plates. It also reminds me, some of them are kind of white with little yellow yolks in, so they look like Haribo eggs.
Yes.
That's what. Oh, but they're all on a white base.
Yes. So, reishi mushrooms, the color scheme I would describe as the 70s. They have a gradient of like this burnt red to a white, so it's like kind of a very 70s color scheme. They're not psychedelic despite the colors. And they grow usually at the base of decadus trees, mainly maples, but they only grow on like 2 to 3 out of 10,000 trees.
Oh, wow, okay.
So they really rely on cultivation, which is why I picked them for this week. So they're super useful. They're antioxidant rich, they fight depression, they regulate blood sugar, anti-carcinogenic. They also boost immunity and focus. So they're the super mushroom.
Yeah, super
I like
shroom.
picking superfoods because I think they're cool. And they can grow on logs, which is what it was growing on the photo I showed you.
Okay.
On piles of sawdust and piles of wood chips. So
I
was picturing...
Politicians reminded you of this?
No, the next question reminded me of this.
Okay.
So I was picturing in a food secure community, perhaps you have piles of compost, you have piles of like these things that are normally considered wasteful, but you could cultivate some reishi on top.
Yeah, sure.
Pretty cool. And they're really pretty and cool. And neither of us really like mushrooms, but they're the one thing that I think if I could convince myself to like any food, it would be mushrooms.
I wish I liked mushrooms as well.
They're really cool.
They seem very good for you. They seem to be key to a lot of meatless cooking. And there's just such a variety. I'm sure I like a lot of mushrooms.
That's the thing. We've only had
I haven't really
literally
tried
one
many.
type.
Yeah.
I've been seeing on the internet these ones that are called puff shrooms, and they're like this big.
They just seem so... They look unhealthy to me.
Because they look like marshmallows.
No, they look... It looks like you'd breathe it in and it would kill you.
Well, the thing is, there's a lot of deadly mushrooms.
Yeah,
there's a lot of deadly mushrooms.
I don't trust that.
They're the future. And also you can make the like mushroom leather out of these ones.
Oh, that's true. Yeah,
which
mushroom
is
leather.
Cool. Yeah. And that leads us to the second question for this week, and it is, what would a food secure community look like? Last week we were talking about what food security is, but I picked a couple of examples to use to demonstrate what a food secure community looks like.
Okay.
So my first one, universities across the world have these social enterprise teams basically that compete, and they all make these little communities called enactus, or they all make these little businesses, and then their little businesses they present them and compete, but they're not just selling iPhones, they're selling usually a product which helps the community, or not even selling, it might just be a non-for-profit that they've created.
Yeah, I didn't realize you'd be just using this podcast to plug your own product.
No, I'm not using my own product.
Alicia was part of Enactus, that's why she knows so much about it.
Yes, I'm using the project from the other school in Halifax.
Okay.
So St. Mary's, they went to nationals, and they might have won they definitely won nationals, but they might have won the world competition with this project, or at least come second. And it's called Square Roots. Their mission statement is to feed every person. Pretty bold.
Concise.
Yes.
Ambitious.
And while feeding every person, they were looking, well, where's the food going? We know we have enough food in Canada, at least, to feed everyone. So why isn't it in the hands of people? And they wanted to tackle food waste with their project. So $31 million of food end up in landfills every year in Canada. And food waste is super, super bad for the environment because it releases a lot of methane. Methane's worse than carbon when it comes to emissions. So they did it in two ways. They partner with farms and grocery stores, farmers markets across the town, and I think even the province, to get all of the undesirables, the apples that have wormholes in them,
yep,
or the potatoes that are too small, and they gather it all together, and every week they just make these bundles of food that is sufficient for the week. Like, they're not just giving you 2 apples and a potato, it's enough to make meals for a week. It's vegetarian for the most part, but it's still sufficient. And then they obviously supplement it with some non-perishables of pasta and what have you. And they just give them away for a small fee. You can choose. So you can either choose to pay $10 for the bundle or nothing, and on the kind of sliding scale. So it's if you can't afford it, they're still going to give it to you. And when you pay the $10, you're subsidizing the cost for the people who can't afford it.
Mm-hmm.
They hand it out all over the town and the municipality because obviously not everyone can make it to this central location. So they make it as accessible as possible. And it's been super successful in creating food security because, one, the food is local. It's not like they're relying on Walmart's leftover food. They're relying on local food. And another thing they do is they do these tokens that they give out. And you can get the tokens, usually I think it is with the food bundles. You'd get your food bundle plus a token or two. And you can take those to a lot of restaurants across the town, and they'll give you food, basically. And a lot of them do at the end of the day. So it's between 3 and 5, you could bring your token in. A lot of restaurants have a lot of food left over at the end of the day because they bulk produce it.
Yeah.
And they just give it to you for the token, and then the tokens go back into this whole system. They also do a thing where they make, I think, out of a lot of random food, because even some of the food waste isn't actually something you're going to eat. You're not going to eat carrot peels. You're not going to eat
onion skins.
Yeah. So they use a bunch of stuff like that, and I think they make beer out of it. They make a lot of different products out of the food waste, which can then be consumed, and they give it away or for a small cost. So it's this really circular system.
Yeah.
But it creates a lot of food security.
It sounds like a really good idea. Do you think things like this spring up because of issues? Do you think it should have to boil down to a bunch of university students to feed the hungry?
No.
So how do you think that could otherwise be fixed?
I think
it's a great initiative, though, but
yeah.
I'm just wondering whether something like that should be mandated, that food waste is minimized as much as possible, whether it should be a government organization exactly like that one.
Yeah.
Or whether it's fine that it is just a school or a group of do-gooders.
I feel in the way things are right now, it's important that it's small.
Okay.
Because everyone wants to support it. Because it's a bunch of kids.
That's
in
true.
the
Maybe
community.
if it was a government, I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And it's the people getting the food. The people handing out the food. But if it was the government, it'd be a little bit less.
People would also be more it sounds judgmental, but people would also be much more willing to exploit it if it was a government program, I feel.
That's likely.
I'm talking about people who can't afford food but just want free food or something like that.
Yeah, certainly.
Just before you say your second example, I wanted to get back to the career politicians because there's something I didn't mention. It's kind of an alternative to our typical representative democracy where we just elect someone and that's our place's person.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit more like jury duty. It's called a citizens' assembly, which is where a group of randomly selected citizens are organized to deliberate on some issue.
Yes.
And the weight of their findings can vary.
Mm-hmm.
The main criticism of this that I saw, which is pretty common, is, well, do you really want a bunch of uneducated randoms effectively forming a government and making decisions for you? And my answer to this would be, if you think that a random pool of people are just uneducated and inadequate to make any kind of decisions together, then there's something wrong with education.
Yeah, it boils down to the education.
And it also, that reply, that response, that criticism is so indicative of the general contempt that I feel people have for each other these days. You know, it's like we'd rather elect a career politician than let other people on our level try and make decisions. It's very rough. The education is so important. I mean, people should just come out of school effectively being able to do a passable job in government. At least being able to form opinions on things, being able to read things critically and, you know, understand things.
It reminds me of when you slowly teach me about football over the years. But you always say you're like, the goalkeepers know how to score penalties super well.
Yeah.
And the defense know how to attack really well, because it's like you need to know a little bit about every position on the pitch or else you're not going to be successful.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's what we all need to be like, and especially the politicians. Like, okay, yes, you're a striker. Yes, you're a politician, or yes, you're a farmer. But you need to know a little bit about all these other areas, or else, like, what's the point?
And I'm not saying everyone has been expert on everything, because that's, as we said at the very beginning of the episode, that's why we have a bunch of people.
Yes.
So you have a bunch of different specialists. But everyone should be okay at everything. I think that's not too much to ask from education, rather than everyone being a whiz at derivatives and integrals in calculus. Doesn't make much sense.
Let us have debate club. That's what I'm crying for.
Is your second example your last one?
Yes.
Do you want to analyze what I came up with for this question?
Yes.
Which I took very literally, because the question was, what does a food secure / food sovereign neighborhood look like? So I drew it, but it is labeled for you.
Thank you. So Aaron's drawings always bring me joy. This is my first time seeing it, and my initial thought was that it was going to be a community garden at the center, but no, it's a feast.
Do you see the people in the feast? It's like the square. It's like the courtyard in the middle of the town. So the drawing is a top-down picture of a food-secure neighborhood.
Yes, so in the middle, there's a feast, which I also came up with for an idea of a food-secure neighborhood.
And you see all the people?
Yes.
Do you see that one hairy one?
Yes.
That's the Grinch.
Oh.
Because when I was doing this, I thought of that scene from The Grinch. I love that scene. He cuts the roast beast, but everyone's there.
Yeah.
That's really the most radical part of the story. It's not the fact that there's this green hairy guy who lives in a mountain. It's the fact that everyone's singing. Everyone in the town is singing on Christmas and sitting down at the same table. It's just such a wondrous idea to me. And I don't think it should be forced, because then it sounds kind of cult-like.
Yeah,
But
what I
just
thought the hairy
community-
person was Florence Pugh from Midsummer. So,
Oh, really?
yeah.
Yeah, I guess there's some Midsummer vibes to it.
Yeah. But not in a cult way, in the Grinch Stole Christmas way.
Yes.
Okay, so there's a feast, which I think is a really excellent idea, because if we're producing food on a really local level, I think it's important to share.
Yeah, well, what I thought you were going to say when you said that group, Square Roots, that they just bag everything up and sell it, was I thought you were going to say they just cook it all.
Yeah.
But I guess that's more like a homeless shelter, but it's a nice idea.
But we've volunteered at this community garden where they do have a space where they create meals with the food that they harvest, and people just come and eat. And it's not just a soup kitchen. It's like everyone comes and eats and contributes to the garden in a little bit, but they also contribute to the cooking and the cleaning. But I think that's an important part of it, because not everyone can be a farmer. But maybe someone could do the dishes, or someone could prepare, or someone could...
I'll chop.
Chop. There we go. Going out from the feast, there's public fountains,
Yes.
which are important for access to water.
Mm-hmm.
There is a variety of seeds.
Yep.
So you just mean not monocultures?
No, no, those are just dots. That's how I drew them. I just think I wasn't really thinking about which seeds. Just that idea of seeds, so important. I was envisioning in in like elementary school, having a seed week where the kids all saw them and like you know how whenever you'd have a themed lesson in elementary school, which was rather rare. The teacher would bring, here's a fossil. They'd bring it in and they'd pass it around. I was envisioning it just with a bucket of seeds. You can see them all. Why is this one curved? Why is this one round? Because I feel like a lot of kids don't see seeds that often.
No, I think it's a great idea.
Seeds. And also, it raises this question of, because with seeds, I think I wrote variety.
Yes.
Variety of seeds.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that there are 400,000 plants in the world, roughly half of which are edible, but like over half of our calories from plants comes from 3 different crops.
Yes.
Which is rough. So when I say variety, I wanted to talk about perhaps this contradiction between variety and localized diet.
Yeah. The thing is, we eat this weirdly localized diet, but it's this locale which doesn't actually exist. It exists in someone's mind, and they said corn, flour, and potatoes. That's
you
what
mean
we're gonna.
North America?
Yeah, but it's not actually one specific geographical place where just naturally these 3 things were abundant.
Of course, there's not a lot of cows in where we used to live in Nova Scotia, but everyone eats a lot of beef.
Yes,
because it's Canadian, North American, generic. But I don't think there's anything per se wrong with that. I wrote localization, but also have a train coming into the picture, so not all localization. Because I think that would that's just moving backwards, I think, personally. But I do think that perhaps we shouldn't grow bananas here. Perhaps it's about the growing, but we can grow things from because there are similar climates to here around the world where things are endemic. So there's a lot of Asian vegetables that would comfortably grow here. They just don't.
Yeah.
But they could. So I think as long as you do things with an eye towards ecosystem security and invasive species and things like that, it's always good to have. I love bok choy.
Yeah. I think variety is super important. And also, if we started eating super local, we'd eat so much stuff that we don't normally. Like, you and I have started trying to eat, like, a variety of root vegetables, even as an example. And it's like, beets grow here and turnips grow here, but we never really ate them because it's easier to eat potatoes.
It's true.
So, I think it could be a very colorful diet. And also,
you mean it might actually force people to eat more stuff than they usually do?
Yeah.
Yeah, I get you.
Because you have here calendar around harvest, which I think is important because we'd be eating seasonally. You can't have apples all year round.
Yes, no, of
but
course.
You could have them for 3 months of the year, and then you make apple jelly and you freeze some.
Yeah, I still think we should preserve foods. I don't think we should go back exclusively to how things used to be. But when I say calendar around the harvest, my idea for it was more cultural in the fact that now our months, our seasons, our holidays are so divorced from any ideas of equinoxes and planting and harvests and feasts because we just don't do those things anymore. And I think the general consensus would be, well, we've moved past that. We don't need to anymore. We have factories, we have centralized food. We can have apples year round. So why the calendar? That doesn't make any sense. My response would be that those things are culture. Like that's what culture is. So when you try and create a culture, which is essentially what we've done now by stripping away all the things that used to form culture, we end up with this weird inertia where no one knows what culture is and it moves too fast and yet at the same time, never.
Yeah.
Because there's no grounding. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
The holidays don't make any sense anymore.
So you also have a store here, which I think is important.
Yeah.
People probably think in a degrown society, I want Subway, I have to go harvest my tomatoes. No, like there's a store. Not everyone's a farmer.
Yeah.
And my case study, I'll just like reference it right quick because it's not super long. It's in a city in Ghana, and there's 1,000 people who earn a living off of the community farms that they have constructed in this town. But everyone other than those 1,000 people buy from them. But they can see the community gardens, they know the farmers.
Yeah, of course.
And just creates healthy food sovereign communities. Because right now, there's hundreds of thousands of farmers across the world, millions, but we don't know any of them. And so we're not going to care about the food waste as much, about their livelihoods, about their conditions even. But you're going to care about these people. And also, if the food chain broke now, or the supply chain, we'd be screwed. But in this case, the food chain between these 1,000 people and then the, say, 9,000 of the people who live in the community, it's not going to break down so easily.
No, it's not going to break down. The reason I have the train and I said not everything local is because it might be less victim to supply chains, but localized food production is more vulnerable to drought.
Weather, yeah.
So that's why it's still important to, that's why these things make sense. Like, I'm not ignorant to that fact.
Yeah. And that's why collaboration is just key. We don't want a bunch of super isolated communities. We want a global community, but also made up of a bunch of tiny communities. A couple more things in your image is rooftop gardens, which I think is a good idea.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be on the roof, but just if you're in an apartment building, be a part of it, something like that. Also, well, you don't even have to be in an apartment building if you're in a neighborhood, but your yard is small. Last year when we went apple picking, that was really fun. Neither of us farm, but it was like, oh, there's a farm nearby.
Yeah.
Let's go pick some apples. And yeah, that was a grounding experience.
Because these people, they don't need to eat all those apples they made. So let other people have the apples. Who would have thought?
We also learned a lot about apples.
We do know all the types now.
Which is why I had that little thing there, education.
Yes.
I feel like we should know more about how to make food, how things grow.
Yeah.
From a young age.
Because you were saying when we were picking apples, you were like, there's so many on the ground. And the farmers were like, yeah, it's a good thing. Because then the nutrients are going to go back in and you have apples next year. If none of the apples fell, the soil would degrade over time.
Yeah.
But we didn't know that. You have to learn it. And kids love to learn about food because you get to taste it.
It's true.
I remember there were like 2 years in elementary school where they had a fruit day.
Fruit day?
Did you have a fruit day?
No, I didn't.
And I don't know why. It was a school-wide thing, and they just had, in each classroom, a basket of fruit with like star fruits and grapefruits and like fruits that none of us had ever tried because we all just ate apples and bananas, and we were all kind of boring. But we were like, whoa, what are these pomegranates? And it happened for 2 years, and I remember the kids going nuts over it. I wouldn't have known that I liked pomegranates if it hadn't been for that day in grade 2.
Yeah.
Because my mom never bought a pomegranate, because why would she? Like, she didn't know what it was, basically. So it's important, and kids love it.
Yeah. Did you dress up as a fruit?
No.
That's how I envision fruit day.
Okay. That can happen. You're banana day free right now. And the last 2 things you have, one is something with the senses, the vibes. So there's a rooster in the morning.
Those 2 symbols mean smells and sounds.
Okay, smells and sounds.
Because I didn't want to just focus on the looks.
So there's a rooster in the morning, which I think is good.
It's a communal sound. It's a communal wake up.
Yeah.
Woken up by the earth itself.
Yeah, when we were in Mexico, there were roosters in the morning.
Loved it.
And I was like, to my host brother, I was like, does he go every morning? And then he was like, yeah, it's very annoying. But I was like, but it's kind of cool because everyone's up. Because this crazy rooster.
Actually, where I used to live in Nova Scotia, there was a rooster on the few streets over. And pretty much anywhere you would go, you could start a conversation with people about that darn rooster. Like everyone just be griping about it. Because no one agreed to it. They thought it was like an infringement or something. But I just thought it was hilarious.
Yeah, it is funny.
How everyone knew it. It was like a local celebrity.
Yeah. You also have compost smells. Pleasant.
Well, I wanted to, let's not romanticize it too much.
Yeah.
It's going to be compost. It's not going to smell good.
Compost. And bells.
Yeah, that's not food related.
To ward off the crows, maybe.
It could be to ward off the crows. It could be to, hey, the feast is ready, guys. I guess I'm just in a Christmassy mood.
Yeah. The cranberry sauce.
If we were to have a podcast sound that plays at the beginning of each episode, I think bells would be a good version.
Or wooden wind chimes. One and the other.
Well, the thing with bells is that people only ever hear them for Christmas. So people are like, oh, I love Christmas bells. And it's like, no, you just like noise, but we never get it any other time.
Pleasant noise. We get lots of unpleasant noise, I think.
True.
And you have healthy and more communal, little bit solar punk. Can you explain?
Yeah, because I think the vision of the town is not exactly all degrowth. There's a little bit of solar punk, i.e., for people who don't know what solar punk is, it's kind of this aesthetic or this vision which combines eco-modernism with degrowth a little bit, I would say.
Mhm.
So there is technological innovation that helps you return to these more communal, traditional, green
Mhm.
lives.
Is degrowth dark green environmentalism? Then solar punk is like bright green. Is that
Yeah, those are synonyms. I mean, those are.
Yeah. So
Those
if
are
anyone
things.
like doesn't know those two words that we're using, those are another thing you can look up, and it might be easier to find the actual visuals if you want to.
Healthy and communal, I just meant communal. I was referring to the apple picking experience that we had, because it wouldn't have been so fun if it was just us there.
Yeah.
Because there was a guy with a tractor who was towing everyone around, which was really fun. And with healthy, I was thinking a lot of this stuff would require money to implement, but that money could kind of be taken out of the healthcare budget a little bit, because people would be healthier.
Mentally, definitely.
No, I think like physically.
But also physically.
We were talking about COVID. It's like a really good long-term solution to protection against diseases like that would be to invest money into healthier food. Then hospitals eventually would get less.
Yeah, it's like very long term.
Of course.
We always want short term, but if people had
healthier food, more active lifestyles.
Yeah, it would just be better for everyone, and then the healthcare system would be less stressed, which is great for everyone because then you're not suffering from heart disease. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And also there'd be decreases in infrastructure budgets. Like you wouldn't have to be paving roads and paying for all of the
highways that would be a reduction as well.
Yeah.
But we're going to talk about transportation next week.
Yeah, but I think there'd be some money for it from other places. Food security is also really...
It's a little bit too practical there. I don't have a conversation.
Okay.
I don't want to talk about where money comes from. Sorry for bringing that up.
Sorry. Thanks, Aaron. Almost derailed the whole vibe.
Yeah, it's supposed to be an imaginative exercise.
Yes.
Anyway.
Thanks for listening.
Hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Bye.